Are you ready for Board Game Nation's coverage of the 2025 Axis and Allies World Championship? Last time we brought you the final from the 1942 second edition tournament from Gen Con. Now it's time for the main event. Prepare for battle as we take you tableside for the 2025 Axis and Allies World Championships featuring the Anniversary Edition. Let's make it hot. Welcome to Board Game Nation. My name is Gary Blevins. Thank you so much for watching. And a thank you to our friends at Renegade Game Studios for sponsoring this video series. This series is produced using products that you can find following the link in the description below. There you'll find all that your Axis and Allies loving hearts can desire and more. We also want to thank the amazing members of Board Game Nation. We could not do this without you. If you want loads of exclusive content, invites to special events, or you just want to support the craziness that we're doing around here, click that join button, find the membership level that's right for you, and become an official citizen of Board Game Nation. In 2023, Renegade Game Studios sponsored the very first Axis and Allies World Championships at Gen Con in Indianapolis. Specifically, the game in question that year was 1942 second edition. My teammate Doug Thorpe and I were thrilled to take home that first title. In 2024, the Anniversary Edition took center stage as the World Championship event, and the title of Axis and Allies World Champions went to Eric Meister and Brandon Roscoe. That year, I opted not to play in any of the events. Instead, Board Game Nation brought a production team to capture the action of loads of the Axis and Allies events and more, with the goal of bringing you a tableside look at some of these amazing games. In 2025, the Axis and Allies World Championships had more than doubled in size since 2023, expanding to a 5-round single-elimination tournament featuring 60 of the top players. With the help of a fantastic production team, Doug and I were able to team up again, jump back into the fray to try to reclaim our title of World Champions. In round 1, we faced first-time tournament players Bryce and Andrew. They played a very good game as the Axis, but they weren't able to subdue China or stand up to the US Navy, and Doug and I advanced to round 2. There we faced a great set of guys from the Northeast that gave us a serious run for our money, despite this also being their first tournament. Brian and Michael hit us with an amazing allied strategy that quickly became the talk of the tournament. Doug and I were able to fight back and squeak out an economic win to advance to the quarterfinals, but there is no doubt that Brian and Michael had a significant impact on the tournament. In the quarterfinals, Doug and I faced a father-son team from Somerset, Kentucky in their second World Championship appearance. As the Allies, they had an excellent command of the Pacific, but Germany was able to take and hold Moscow in round 5, which allowed Doug and I to advance to the semifinals, where we faced the winner of the fantastic quarterfinal match that we'll be bringing you today. Now, we try to keep these play-by-plays / battle reports to a reasonable length. As a result, some of our more in-depth analysis, aka wild tangents, might end up on the cutting room floor. That's why we have our live streams. Doug and I are going to be going live on the Friday following the release of this video to share our thoughts and answer community questions about this game and really anything Axis and Allies related. We hope to see you there. If you can't make it live, that's okay. That conversation will be available at BoardGameNation.com shortly after it wraps up. Now, this quarterfinal match has a bunch of twists and turns that we can't wait to share, but first, it's time for the Choose Your Own Adventure portion of the show. If this is your first time watching our coverage of an ANA event, welcome. We've got a few things to share that'll help make this make more sense. If you have seen our other videos and have a good handle on our production style, but need a refresher on the tournament rules, you can jump ahead to this timestamp. If you don't need any of that, feel free to jump ahead to this timestamp to get right into the game. Okay, here's how this works. Board Game Nation brought a production team to Gen Con to record loads of Axis and Allies games and more. Now, anyone who's played Axis and Allies knows that even the shortest ANA games can be hours long, and even as much as I love this game, I find watching raw gameplay footage about as much fun as watching paint dry in the rain. So, what my team have done is record every move of our featured games and then rebuild those games move for move in the studio, taking still images along the way to make the action much easier to follow. Today, Doug and I are going to give you a full detailed battle report for the 2025 World Championship quarterfinal, discuss some strategic and tactical options, and try to have some fun along the way. Time to talk tournament rules. With some minor variations, casual play and online play have basically the same rules. Because tournaments have lots of players and a limited amount of time, the rules for tournament play have some significant differences. Today we'll be looking at tournament play for the 40th Anniversary Edition. There are 3 big rules differences that you need to know. Number 1, players bid for sides. Rather than a random draw, when a match begins, they start a bidding process that, when completed, may allow players accepting a bid to place additional units on the map prior to the start of the game. A good bid and the placement of those units can make a huge difference in a game. A while back, we made a video that lays out all the rules for bidding. If you want to know more about that, you can follow this link right here. Number 2, Anniversary Edition comes with 2 different scenarios, 1941 and 1942. In tournament play, the 1942 scenario is what is used. However, national objectives and research and development are excluded from the game, but the optional fighter escorts and interceptor rules is in effect. Lastly, and most importantly, number 3. Tournament games have a very specific time limit and win conditions. In the case of the Anniversary Edition, the game ends at the end of 6 hours of play. The Anniversary Edition features 18 victory cities. The team controlling the most victory cities at the end of the allowed time wins. In the event of a 9-9 tie, the side with the highest economic production is your winner. As you can imagine, this change in win conditions changes the strategies quite a bit. Now, that isn't to say that tournament strategies won't work in casual or online play, but their target is a bit different. The time limit typically shifts the goal to controlling more victory cities than your opponent when the time expires, rather than the victory conditions set out in the rulebook. Now, this rule set also lends itself to much more aggressive strategies that can be a ton of fun. Just something to keep in mind as you follow the action. A quick disclaimer. My team and I did our best to recreate the games as accurately as possible, but things happen in the heat of a game and during the recreation process that may have caused some minor details to get lost. Still, I'm confident that any minor discrepancies wouldn't have made any significant difference to the outcome of any of our games. Also, in the pictures, you're going to see the different colored chips offset like this. This was done intentionally to make them easier to see in the pictures. In reality, they stack just fine. All right, that's enough for now. You'll pick up the rest as we go. Let's get the 2025 Axis and Allies World Championships underway. All right, my friends, please welcome Doug Thorpe to the show.
It's good to be here as always, Gary. Looking forward to talking about this game. I'm excited. Got some great players here.
Yes, we do. We've got some exceptional players here. Got Eric and Brandon, who are the defending world champions, and I believe Eric is the number 2 winningest player of all time at Gen Con, and Brandon is on that list as well, versus Brian and Adam, who were finalists at the Spring Gathering this year. They were semifinalists at the World Championship last year, and they've made it so far to the quarterfinals in the 2025 competition. Let's see if they can make it to the semifinals this year and take down some truly epic players. So I'm excited about this game. Let's dive right in. Like all tournament matches, they began with a bid, and that starts with a roll to determine who gets the initiative. And in this instance, they rolled, and Eric and Brandon won the initiative here. They get to either make the opening bid or they get to defer and let the opponents do it. They decided to make the opening bid, and they started pretty aggressively. They clearly wanted to play the Allies. They were willing to give the Axis plus 5 IPCs to allow them to play the Allies. Without hesitation, Brian and Adam accepted that bid of 5 and placed a tank in Burma, which I think is exactly the right place for it. It gives them a really great shot at that fighter in Yunnan on J1. Doug, any thoughts about this one?
Yeah, that seems like an aggressive bid. I might have started with 3 and seen if I could got someone to take it. But yeah, I mean, that's a good way to go. You want to be the Allies, make it happen, and that is the right place to place that tank. I like it.
All right, that takes us to J1. They start with 31 IPCs. They're going to kick us off with 1 infantry, 2 transports, a sub, and a destroyer. For combat moves, they are going to Pearl. They're going to go there with a fighter, a bomber, 1 sub, and 1 destroyer to try to take out the destroyer, carrier, and fighter that are there. They're going to move into C-Zone 35 with the carrier, 3 fighters, and a battleship. Just a little programming note here. When you see a die next to an air unit, that is the number of moves that it has used to get to where it is now. So the fighter that has a 4 next to it came from the island of Formosa. That was 1 out into the C-Zone, 2 into 36, 3 into 37, and the 4th move into C-Zone 35. Because it will have no moves left at the end of the turn, if it is still alive, it will have to land on that carrier. If the carrier isn't there, it'll splash into the ocean because it can't move any further. So as you see those die around the board as we move through the game, that's what that means. They move into Suiyuan with 4 infantry and a fighter, into Fujian with an infantry and a tank with the offshore shots from the battleship and the cruiser, and into Yunnan with 3 infantry, the tank that they got in the bid, and 2 fighters to try to take out the 2 infantry and that flying tiger. How did it go for them? They were successful all around. They took out all of the units in Suiyuan, took no losses there, no losses in Fujian, but it looks like they did lose a couple of infantry in Yunnan. They were successful in C-Zone 53. They took out the carrier, the fighter, and the destroyer that were there. They did take 1 hit, and instead of losing the sub, which is the less expensive unit, they opted to lose the destroyer, leaving the sub in place. I think that's an interesting choice. They took no losses in C-Zone 35, wiped out all of the UK forces that were there. Obviously a pretty lopsided battle here. Only 14 IPCs lost for the Axis and a mountain for the Allies. For their non-combat move, the Japanese moved that bomber out of C-Zone 53, land in the Caroline Islands. The fighter that moved out of Pearl has moved up to 62. It is joined by the carrier that came out of 51, along with another fighter that I believe was in Suyuan. A fighter lands in Kiangsu, 2 fighters in French Indochina, Thailand, and both fighters landed in C-Zone 35 on the carrier with that battleship. So they mobilized into C-Zone 62 with the guy, of course, on the island of Japan. That puts 5 infantry and an artillery there with 3 transports in reach, counting the one in C-Zone 61. Doug, any thoughts about Japan's opening here?
Yeah, I think it was good. It's interesting to me, the third fighter going into C-Zone 35 against the British fleet. Often you take 2. I think with 2 fighters, it's like a 93 or 96% toward the Japanese on that battle. But I've seen a lot of people take 3. I guess the idea is you just ensure you don't lose anything because you really crush them in the first roll. So I usually take 2, but I've gone back and forth on taking 3. So I like it. It gives China the opportunity to get an extra guy, but maybe keeping those fighters and just ensuring you wipe out Britain in one round is more important than that. So I think it was a good opening. I think the buy, I don't know that I love a sub purchase right off the bat. I mean, I guess US doesn't have a destroyer, so it's good to keep the US at bay. We'll see how that plays out, but I would have probably gone a little different with the buy.
Yeah, I think the fact that the U.S. doesn't have a destroyer is the main reason that they kept the sub in C-Zone 53, right? So that fleet up there doesn't have any protection from that sub. Obviously, it's only going to get one shot because everybody gets to fire back, but it might be able to pick off something if it's left behind. I also thought it was interesting that they left one of the guys in Kiangsu out of the fight so that when they didn't attack Hubei, they don't have to worry about that guy stepping in and taking the victory city in Shanghai. So I think the infantry and the fighter in Kiangsu keeps the Chinese out of that territory for another turn, which I think is a really interesting choice. They also kept the guy in Hong Kong out of the battle so that he can step down into French Indochina, Thailand. He wasn't in the battle in Fujian, so I think that's something a little different than we've seen before, and certainly different than we've done in the past. That takes us over to the Soviets for their first turn. They kick off the game with 24 IPCs, and they buy guys. They got themselves 8 infantry this time. For their combat move, they are moving to the west. They send 6 infantry and a fighter into Belorussia. Looks like eastern Ukraine is looking at 4 infantry and artillery and 4 tanks. And into Ukraine is 2 infantry and artillery and a bomber. They also step down into Manchuria with a guy from Buryatia to liberate that territory. Of course, when they liberate that territory, that doesn't mean they take control of it. It reverts to the control of the Chinese because it is originally a Chinese territory. On the Western Front, they were successful in taking Belorussia, but man, it cost them a ton to do it. There was a lot of rolling back and forth in that battle. They lost 5 infantry in that fight. Eastern Ukraine looks like they lost 2 or 3, and in Ukraine they lost 2 infantry there, but they were successful in taking all 3 territories. Total losses this time looks like it's a total of 10 infantry there for the Russians. That is significant for them, but not as significant as losing all of those offensive pieces. For the Germans, they lost 3 tanks and an artillery along with 7 infantry. For the Russians' non-combat move, they consolidate in Sherbet with 7 infantry. That's a pretty good stack. They stepped down from Evenki into Novosibirsk. They moved into Russia. They moved out of Urals and into Archangel. And the air units landed in Caucasus. They moved the AA gun out of Karelia and into Archangel, but they moved the AA gun that was in Moscow into eastern Ukraine to defend the land units that are there. The only note here I think is interesting is that nobody moved into Chinese territory this time. So they're kind of leaving the Chinese on their own for the moment. For their mobilization, they've got those 8 infantry. 4 are going to go into the Caucasus and 4 into Moscow. That is the end of the Russians' turn. Let's see what Germany thinks for round 1. They start the game with 37 IPCs this time. They are going to kick us off with 3 tanks, an artillery, and 6 infantry. They are going on the ground in this game. For their combat moves, it is back to the east. They are going to try to punish that guy in Belorussia to finish off the last of that force. They are staying out of eastern Ukraine this time, which I think is an interesting choice. They had a shot at some pretty valuable tanks there. They didn't decide to go that way. But they went with 2 infantry and a fighter into Ukraine. Out in the Atlantic, they made a very controversial choice. They are opting not to attack the UK fleet in C-Zone 2 or in C-Zone 1. Instead, they're going to send a sub over to C-Zone 10 to try to take take out the American destroyer and 2 transports that are there. They're going to send a fighter and a bomber and a sub and the destroyer out of the med into C-Zone 12 to try to take out the cruiser and the destroyer that are there. So the Germans do step up and take Karelia, which is a victory city in this game. The start of this game, the Allies start with 10 victory cities. The Axis only start with 8, so this will bring them up to a 9-9 tie. If the game were to end with each side having 9 victory cities, then it would come down to an IPC race. Whoever is producing more IPCs when time expires will be the winner if the victory cities are tied. Right now, they're tied. Let's see if it stays that way. Doug, any thoughts about the German opening combat move here?
Yeah, inland, first of all, this is why I actually like this opening for Russia. This is something that you and I have toyed with, I think the exact same allocation numbers, or maybe even going a few less tanks into eastern Ukraine. But I do like it because if you stack eastern Ukraine with Russia like this, it's pretty dicey for Germany to go back in. So even though you see these juicy tanks and think, oh, well, maybe there's an opportunity, if there's the AA gun, infantry, and artillery, I personally think it's best not to attack it. So I like Germany's move here inland. I don't know so much about not hitting C-Zone 2, though. What are the odds in C-Zone 10? I can't remember. You got like, is it like a 30% chance or something like that? Yeah, I just don't know that it's worth it. And leaving Britain with that transport destroyer and battleship is pretty strong. So we'll see how it plays out for them, but I don't know that I love the naval moves.
All right, well, let's see how the dice tumbled for them. They were successful in taking out the Americans in C-Zone 10. In C-Zone 12, they also took out the British fleet, but they lost a fighter, the sub, and the destroyer in that fight, so that was an expensive one for them. On the Eastern Front, they were successful in Belarusia. They were also successful in Ukraine. And of course, they took Karelia because it was uncontested. Losses this time for the Axis, pretty light compared to a pretty heavy Allied loss here. Lots of C units going to the bottom of the Atlantic this time. For the Germans' non-combat move, that bomber heads back to Germany. They used the transport in C-Zone 5. I thought this was interesting. To grab the AA gun that's in Germany, carry it up to Karelia along with the infantry that is in Northwest Europe. The transport that's in C-Zone 13 grabbed the guy, moved into Libya, along with the units that are in Morocco. Everything else moved to the east for the most part and stacked up primarily in Poland and eastern Poland. So I think they're in a pretty reasonable position to defend Karelia. It looks like there's only 1 infantry and some air units that might be able to push into there. And I don't think that they can crack East Poland at this point.
I can't say that I've ever seen someone move that AA gun like that, and I really like it. I think it's so simple, but so smart.
Yeah, I like that move too. They mobilize all of their units into Berlin and end their turn collecting 36 IPCs this time and turn the action over to the United Kingdom for their first turn. They kick us off with a carrier, a transport, and a fighter, clearly looking to build on the fleet that has kind of been gifted to them in the North Atlantic. And to further that advantage in their combat moves, they use the transport that's in C-Zone 2. They pick up a couple of guys from the UK and land in Norway. They send the 2 fighters and the bomber into C-Zone 5 to try to take out all of the German units that are there. And they step out of India with 1 guy into Burma to take that territory. Of course, they take Burma for free, no trouble there. And of course, they took Norway, but they did lose a fighter in C-Zone 5 in exchange for most, anyway, of the German Navy, losing a cruiser, destroyer, and the Baltic transport. One correction here, the Germans, during their non-combat move on G1, they did move that sub out of C-Zone 5 and into C-Zone 7. For their non-combat, they move the fighter up from Australia into India. The guy from Persia steps over. The transport comes around the Cape of Good Hope and ends in C-Zone 33, tempting the Japanese air units in C-Zone 35 to see if they want to stay to the west side of their territory. They bring the cruiser and the transport over from C-Zone 1 with the infantry and the tank from East Canada to land those in the United Kingdom. They consolidate almost all of their units into Transjordan, leaving 1 guy in Egypt to stop the German blitzing tank. They mobilize the carrier and the fighter and that transport into C-Zone 3.
I didn't like it moving the transport up to C-Zone 32. It should have stayed further south in 28. That forces Japan to move the carrier and maybe even the battleship to the east coast of Africa if you want the transport. But moving it within range of the fighter just gives it to them for free, basically. And just imagine what the Japanese situation would look like if they didn't have that extra carrier all the way up there where they could land 4 fighters on it. Instead, that carrier is all the way down off of Madagascar. So I think that's pretty significant. And I don't like moving that transport up that far north.
Okay, it's a good thought. I like that. So at the end of the UK's turn, they're going to collect 36 IPCs this time with the control of Norway and Burma. That's 5 right there. So they're in pretty good shape financially. Plus, they've got a pretty sizable fleet now in Sea Zone 3 that the Germans aren't going to be able to take out anytime soon. Any thoughts about the UK's opening here?
I like the way they consolidated in Transjordan with the fighter. A lot of times people will fly that fighter all the way to India, even though it's not really needed in India at this point. And I like that they added to their Atlantic fleet. It is interesting, the choice not to build a complex in India. With so much of a fleet in the Atlantic intact, I think there would have been the temptation to build a carrier and a complex and then try to balance between the two. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out long term. But yeah, I mean, I thought their moves were solid. I like it.
That takes us to the Italians for their first turn. They start the game with 10 IPCs. They use it to buy a destroyer on round 1. For their combat move, they are going to move into Sea Zone 15 to try to take out the destroyer. With the transport, they're bringing a guy and a tank, along with the 2 infantry from Libya, to try to take over Egypt. They've got to get through the destroyer first. Of course, they've got no trouble doing that with a battleship and 2 cruisers. And then they move into Egypt, and they take out that territory, taking no losses this time. That's 11 down for the Allies, 0 for the Axis. They're non-combat. They move into Bulgaria, Romania. They leave an infantry and an artillery in Rome. In the event, I suppose, of a premature landing in France, maybe getting ready for that, I'm not sure. Otherwise, that is the completion of the Italian turn. They mobilize their destroyer into Sea Zone 14 to give a little bit of cover, I think, to this German transport that is there. You can't just send a fighter now or a bomber to take that thing off for free without putting anything at risk. So I think that may be the purpose of that destroyer.
I think it also just strengthens your fleet a little bit. When Britain has as big of a fleet, it's easy to wipe out the Italian fleet. So it just gives them a little extra.
Over to the Americans for their first turn. Eric, who says in the video that he's been making this purchase since they came out with this edition, which is quite some time ago. So he's got himself 2 carriers and a fighter on the way. I know that this is how Doug prefers to see this. So to my friend, he's got 2 carriers there and a fighter.
I like it.
There you go.
Way better.
That's for you. For their combat moves, they do have that destroyer in Sea Zone 20 that can slide through the Panama Canal and go after that sub, and that is exactly what they do. They send the destroyer along with all 3 bombers to try to get that sub. They're mad at him. They're mad at this sub. He had a family, but not anymore. He's all done now. The destroyer takes him out. That's 6 to the Axis, 0 for the Allies lost. Those 3 bombers head over to Western Canada to post up there, along with 3 fighters into Sea Zone 56, and then all of the land units moved to the west side of the United States, west or central, as far as they could get to the left. They mobilized both carriers and that fighter into Sea Zone 56 with the rest of the fleet that's there, making a pretty substantial Pacific fleet right at the end of US 1 there. Pretty strong position. I really like this. I really like the bombers posting up in West Canada rather than Western United States. So it can get to all the same places, but it can get into the Atlantic much faster.
I agree. I've actually seen people put their infantry there also because you can hit Alaska or you can go to Ottawa.
The Chinese are going to get 2 infantry this time because they control 5 territories. They get 1 infantry for every 2 territories that they control, rounded down. So they're going to get 2 guys this time. They don't have any combat, but they do make a non-combat move to bring the guy from Qinghai forward into Xikang. So there's 2 guys there now, and that is also where they mobilize the 2 incoming guys to give them a total of 4 infantry now in that space. A little scary for the infantry and the tank, or maybe the 2 tanks, to come into Yunnan there, so a little bit of a deterrent. And that is the end of US 1. The UK has a pretty strong position in the North Atlantic, and the Germans have no naval power to speak of, so the UK is going to be able to move around up there at will, which is a dangerous position for the Germans to put themselves in. The Russians are doing okay. They're going to be pushing back and forth, it seems like, on that western front. So the question will be whether or not they can make it back to Karelia to try to get back in the lead here, or if there's going to be another victory city that they can pick up. The Italians are staged very nicely to start pushing into Africa, or maybe even into the Middle East. And of course, in the Pacific, we've got the Americans clearly starting to build up a naval force, and the Japanese trying to gobble up as many territories as they can. To that end there, Doug, what do you think about how the Allies have played this first round?
I think overall good. I like America's move. It's pretty simple and straightforward. The Russian attack was good, and Britain's moves were good as well. I don't love the Chinese infantry placement. By moving the guy forward into Xikang and then by placing the two guys there, you're just putting yourself in a position to get all the Chinese infantry annihilated. Maybe it's intentional. Maybe you're hoping to bait Japan that way to give India one more round. But since you don't have a complex in India, I don't really know that it matters that much if Japan steps north one round and then back south against you. Japan can get there with an infantry, 2 tanks, and 3 fighters. Then you're just done as China. So I would think you'd be a little preferable to put one guy there and then stack 3 guys back in Qinghai to the far west. That way you still have something that can defend that territory and even come back against Japan. So I don't love that. I don't love that placement.
All right. Well, let's see what Japan decides that they want to do on their second turn. They are starting the turn with 34 IPCs. They are going to purchase themselves 2 new fighters, another sub, a tank, and a guy going into J2. For their combat move, they want this guy out of Manchuria. That is 3 IPCs that Japan desperately wants back. They're going to send a couple of guys up from Suyuan and the fighters from 62 in there to take those guys out. Hupei is in trouble. They've got 3 infantry, 2 fighters headed that way. Burma, man, this is another overwhelming battle. Here they've got 2 infantry, 2 tanks, 2 fighters, and a bomber headed in to take out that one guy in Burma. The Japanese clearly really want that space. They also do send a fighter from 35 out to take out the transport in 33. The destruction of this transport will make it harder for the infantry, the artillery, and Rhodesia to be part of any counterattack in Egypt. It's a strategic choice, for sure, for sure. As for the results of those battles, they were successful in Manchuria. Looks like they took no losses there. They took out the guy in Hupei, and of course they took out the guy in Burma. All losses for the Allies this time. That's the transport and 3 infantry. Nobody home for the Axis. Non-combat, they are moving towards Calcutta. They are not even being subtle about it. They've moved the 2 tanks and a couple of infantry into Burma, left over from the battle, and they are bringing all of those transports down with the guys out of Manila and Tokyo into French Indochina, Thailand. So they have staged pretty heavily here for an attack into Calcutta. That puts the bomber, 2 fighters in French Indochina, 4 fighters in Season 36, all within a range of Calcutta on the next turn if they want it. So they've got a lot of pressure there, so something to keep an eye on. They also are being a little sneaky here. Again, the Americans don't have a destroyer in that fleet, so they push those 2 subs out there to Sea Zone 52, and they've got another one coming in here. So they are definitely trying to be a little sneaky with these subs, and might, if the Americans aren't careful, it might bite them in the butt here. So we'll see how it goes. The fighter that attacked the transport in Sea Zone 33 landed in Egypt, which is, I think, the first time I've seen that happen, which I think is a pretty clever spot for that. It's always good, I think, when you can get multinational forces into an area, because you can kind of start making your 1-2 punches. This is a little early for that now, but I do like the mixed units there. I think that's a really good complementary move for them. They mobilize the 2 fighters, the infantry, the tank, and the sub in and around Tokyo, and they've got the fleet pretty far to the south. The Americans might have something to say about that. We will see how they play it. Over to the Russians for their second turn. They purchase 8 infantry and an artillery. For their combat move, they are pushing back against that western line. They decide to stay out of Karelia this time, though. But they go into Belorussia with 3 infantry and artillery and a bomber. They're into Ukraine with 2 infantry and a fighter. Results this time, they were successful in all of their battles. They took out the infantry in Belorussia and in Ukraine, reforming the western line. But they, again, are still out of Karelia. 2 infantry and an artillery, 10 IPCs lost for the Axis this time, nobody for the Allies. They do step out of Sherbet. They bring those 7 infantry into Buryatia, putting some pressure on Manchuria there. The sub moved out of Sea Zone 2 down to Sea Zone 12. They moved the air units back to Caucasus. The tanks are evacuating eastern Ukraine and heading back to Moscow. The AA gun that was in Archangel is moving into Moscow, as well as the guy from Novosibirsk. Again, Russians offering no support here to a struggling China. They mobilized those 8 infantry and the artillery. That's 4 infantry and the artillery into Moscow and the rest into Caucasus.
The Russian armor should have moved to the Caucasus instead of Moscow, Because it would have given them the ability to liberate India for Britain or help with the defense of Britain by moving them down there. Now, maybe when the time comes, Russia can't afford to move those tanks out of their own territories, but at least gives you the option. Whereas in Russia, they're just not doing anything.
All right, over to the Germans for their second turn. They are starting this round with 36 IPCs, and they are going to pick up 12 dudes. They want a big stack of guys because they're going to be defending themselves against the British here, so they bought themselves a bunch of guys. For their combat moves, they are pushing back again into that eastern front, and they're going to try to liberate Norway. Looks like 3 infantry and a bunch of air units into Belarusia. Looks like one infantry, 1 fighter into eastern Ukraine, so they're not going at that super heavy. They just want to try to pick off the guy, it looks like. If they take it, I guess that's a bonus. Into Ukraine, though, they're going very heavy. They're coming with 4 infantry and looks like 6 tanks against just the 2 guys. They are looking to build a stack there in Ukraine, it seems. After all the dice are rolled, they were successful in Belarusia. They did take out the guy in eastern Ukraine, but were not able to take the territory as their only land unit was destroyed in the battle. They were successful, of course, in taking Ukraine. They've got, looks like 4 infantry there now with 6 tanks. Pretty sizable force. They also took Norway, barely, leaving just 1 infantry there and keeping the 2 fighters. Non-combat for the Germans, they take the transport with the infantry and the artillery from Libya and move that up to add to the stack in Ukraine. They also land the fighter and the bomber in Berlin and make a big stack now in the Baltic states, evacuating from Karelia, taking the AA gun with them. So they've got a pretty healthy stack in the Baltic states, and the stack continues to move east into Poland. There they've got themselves 6 infantry and an artillery, but just the 1 guy in Belarusia, and now only 1 poor Italian tank hanging out in East Poland there. They also moved their infantry and the tank out of Libya and into Egypt. The sub comes around the corner into the Med. It is now in Sea Zone 13. They've got 12 guys to mobilize. 10 of them are going into Berlin, the other 2 into Karelia.
I find it strange that they sent their sub to the Med. I'm not really sure. I don't have any great ideas for it, but what's it doing in the Med for them?
I think the only benefit to it being in the Med, it's not in reach of any Allied destroyers at the moment.
I'm still just like a little perplexed by this game. I don't like what Germany's doing, just to be honest.
What about it don't you like?
I mean, maybe the Allies are a little short on land units. They should have dropped 1 guy in Norway instead of 2. I'm just kind of like, how did they not? They could take Norway. They could take Finland. They could take Karelia. They could take all 3 of those this round, just about, with no problem. And be up 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 for the Allies. I mean, that's the worth of all of Africa. Like, let them have Africa.
This is a tricky game. Like, there's a lot of things here that, like, at this early stage didn't seem to make a lot of sense, but later on you're like, oh, okay, I get it now. Yeah. So there's quite a bit of that in this game. Coming into UK's second turn, they've got themselves 36 IPCs. They spend them on 5 infantry, an artillery, a fighter, and another transport. That gives them their 4th transport, which is kind of the magic number for the UK. The United Kingdom can only produce 8 units per turn, so 4 transports usually means 4 full transports each turn. So this is a key moment for the UK, and the fact that they're in this moment, or will be in this moment at the end of UK2, is significant. I'm
gonna stop apologizing for being nitpicky. I don't like this build for Britain.
Okay.
I get the idea that they're purchasing a transport probably really for use in the following rounds so they can build more land units, but I'm wondering if adding a destroyer in, given the size of the German Air Force, would have been a better choice. You're not even using all of your transports that you have at this moment in the game, so I'm wondering if they went to 4 transports a little too prematurely.
They are going into Norway with 2 tanks. They are going into Karelia with an infantry, artillery, 2 fighters, and the bomber. So they're going to try to take those 2 territories this turn. They've got an offshore shot from the cruiser going into Norway and an offshore shot from the battleship going into Karelia. So they've got pretty good odds on all of those battles for sure. It's worth noting that there is a tank on the transport that's in Sea Zone 5 and a second tank that is attacking Norway from Sea Zone 3. So they've got 2 tanks going into Norway, each coming from a separate transport. Transports can only hold a guy and a thing. Right? So in this instance, they're just carrying a thing. They send the fighter up from Transjordan into Sea Zone 16 to pick off that pesky German transport. And then when all of the smoke clears, they are successful. They did lose 1 tank in Norway, but they did take the territory. They got rid of the 1 guy, and they were successful in taking Karelia, again losing 1 unit there. Losses this time. It looks like 3 infantry and a transport versus a guy and a tank for the Allies. For their non-combat, they're moving out of Transjordan, they're moving out of India, and they're moving entirely into Persia. The tank and the two fighters are moving into Caucasus to try to defend that territory from the Germans that are in Ukraine. Otherwise, they have evacuated Transjordan and India, which I think is a curious choice. I don't know that they could have defended Calcutta. There's a lot of Japanese pressure there, but we'll talk about that more in a moment. In the north, they moved the entire fleet into Sea Zone 5. But there was a mistake made here. This was a complicated battle. There was lots of pieces moving around. So the transport that was in Sea Zone 3 and offloaded the tank in Norway during combat also then made a non-combat move over to Sea Zone 1. They're looking to, obviously, to pick up the two infantry there that are in eastern Canada, but that technically was not a legal move. Like I said, there's a lot of pieces moving around here. Everybody's human. Technically a mistake there. So these things happen. They go to mobilize, and they put that transport, the new transport, is going into Sea Zone 2, and of course the rest of the units going into the United Kingdom. It's worth noting here that that transport in Sea Zone 2 is not in any danger because with control of Norway, the German bomber in Berlin doesn't have a place to land. Over to Italy for their second turn. They are starting round 2 with 14 IPCs, and they're going to use it to purchase 3 infantry and a tank of their own. For their combat move, of course, they're going to move into the unoccupied Transjordan with, looks like, 4 infantry and an artillery, using the transport to pop up there and grab the infantry, the artillery that were left in Rome. The tank that was in Egypt dropped down to Anglo-Egypt, Sudan, grabbed it, and then moved back into Egypt. They also, and I thought this was a little froggy. The Italian tank that was in East Poland, with the help of its fighter, are going to go try to take Karelia. They've got an artillery there. The British only have an artillery piece there defending it. So if they can take this back, it'll stop the Russians from being able to build there on their turn, which is okay. It's not, a big deal, but the Italians decide to run up here and try to grab this space. Of course, they were successful. They didn't have any trouble with the unoccupied territories in Africa and in the Middle East. In Karelia, though, this was a battle. They rolled like 9 times in this battle, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And eventually, they each got a hit. The UK artillery was destroyed, but that hit back. And that forced the Italians to decide how badly they wanted to control the territory versus losing their fighter. They went back and forth about it for a minute or two, and then ultimately decided to lose the fighter in this battle so that the tank could actually claim the territory. I think that's an interesting choice. Doug, I wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, you prevent Russia from building there, but Russia could come in with an infantry and a bomber and blow your tank up. Granted, they can't build there, but you end up losing the fighter and the tank if that happens. So I don't feel like Russia building there would have been that significant personally. So I think I would have just let the UK, or I guess Russia, keep the territory and kept the fighter out.
I'm not sure I would have attacked it in the first place. I mean, it's a bold move, and I appreciate the boldness of it, but you've lost a fighter, you got an artillery, and you did get 2 IPCs extra, I guess, so there's that.
Yeah, I guess you're thinking there's a 1 in 3 chance they'll hit you. You're just assuming you're going to get it. I don't love the attack, but I think I like losing the fighter even less.
For the Italians non-combat, they bolster the Germans in the Ukraine, moving in 2 infantry and the tank from the Balkans. They mobilize the 3 infantry and the tank into Rome and turn the action over to the United States for their second turn. They purchase another carrier, a destroyer. Too many subs out there to go without one. They buy themselves a destroyer and the fighter. For their combat moves, they move out to Iwo Jima and pummel the poor dude that is there. They go with an infantry and a tank, as well as 4 fighters, the battleship and the cruiser, against the one poor guy in Iwo Jima. Of course, they took him out with no problem, and he did not take anybody with him. The U.S. forces on these transports in these forward positions are worth their weight in hard-pressed plastic. They are very, very valuable. And so the fact that the Japanese unit missed there is a big deal. For non-combat, the rest of the fleet moves into Sea Zone 59, catches the fighters that, of course, were involved in that battle. The bombers all move down into Hawaii, and then the last of the land units move into the western United States. The destroyer is making its way back from Norfolk, back through the Panama Canal, heading back into the Pacific Theater. They mobilize the carrier, the fighter, and the destroyer into San Francisco, splashing into Sea Zone 56. Let's see what China has on their plate. They're going to get themselves 1 infantry. This time they're only in control of 3 territories at the beginning of their turn, so they're only going to get 1 guy at the end. So they decide to do no combat this time, opting not to step into Yunnan, which is kind of an odd choice, but they decide to move everybody back to Qinghai and then mobilize the additional unit into Ningxia to make that a little bit harder to step into. But that is how the Americans and the Chinese ended round 2. Doug, any thoughts about round 2?
Yeah, I think it was a good round overall. I think pressing into Iwo Jima is smart, really putting the pressure on Japan to decide if they're going to go south and hit India in force or come up and defend their homeland. I think I probably would have stepped into Yunnan.
All right. Over to Japan for their third turn. They start this round with 35 IPCs. They're going to pick themselves up another carrier, a fighter, a destroyer, and 1 guy. For Japan's combat move, they are done with these Russians in Buryatia. They decide to come up and try to clear that space with all of the land units that were in Japan, as well as the guys that were in Manchuria, and nearly all of their air units going into that space to try to take out those 7 Russian infantry. They also step into Calcutta with 1 guy to take it for free. They push into Suyuan with 3 infantry. They step into Xikang to take that territory for free. So they've got quite a bit going on in this round. One other combat move. They decided to take the 2 subs in 52 and take a shot at the destroyer, the carrier, and the fighter in Sea Zone 56. Remember that the subs can never hit the fighter. Whether there's a destroyer available on either side doesn't matter. Subs can never hit air units. So in this instance, they're going after the destroyer and the carrier. If they get 2 hits here, both of them would be destroyed because the fighter can't take a hit. So the fighter would be able to land in the western United States, but it would definitely slow down the Americans by a lot. So this is a bit of a gamble. It's like 1 in 6, I think, for them to be able to get both. But if they get it, it's huge. Well, they were successful in Buryatia. They got rid of all 7 infantry. They're there now with 4 infantry, a tank, and all of their air units are still intact. They were successful in Ningxia. Now they're with 3 infantry. The bomber survives. Of course, they take Xikang for free. They take Calcutta for free. They got 1 hit and then got destroyed in Sea Zone 56. So there are no American destroyers in the Pacific Theater, which is an interesting place to be. Sometimes good, sometimes bad, but it is a reality to keep in mind. Let's say it that way. For their non-combat moves, the bomber heads back to French Indochina along with a fighter. The rest of the fleet moves back up to Sea Zone 62. They're now in that space with a considerable force. That's 6 fighters on what will be 3 carriers after mobilization. There's a destroyer, 2 battleships, a cruiser, and a sub. So pretty substantial space there. And then a bunch of additional units move down to Burma. They've kind of created India as a no man's land where they're going to take it. They expect the UK to try to take it back, and they're prepared to try to start trading that space back and forth. The difference is that the UK can't build any units down there, and the Japanese may be able to, with their transports, bring additional units to try to reinforce that fight later on. But the UK really can't. So they'll be relying perhaps on the Russians to help them with this battle later on. But for now, they're kind of on their own. And the Italians are knocking from the west. So it's a little kind of a tricky situation there in Calcutta for the Allies. They mobilized those units in and around Tokyo, and that is the end of Japan's third turn. They collect 41 big IPCs this time. That American fleet with the bombers and the new carrier are eyeballing this fleet. We will see on their turn if they decide to go after them.
I think this round, what Japan did highlights maybe the issue with not building a complex in India on UK1. If the UK would have built a complex, even if they build 3 infantry this round and keep what's there in India, you really force Japan to make a decision. Whereas by just pulling out of India, which I think can be a very, very successful strategy, by the way, I've seen it work very well for the Allies more than once. But you kind of allow Japan to just move everything up north, all of their air units, as opposed to making them commit to India. There's good reasons that Britain didn't build that complex, but had they built the complex, it would not have freed Japan to just kind of move everything away.
All right, over to the Russians for their third turn. They are starting this turn with 26 big IPCs, and they used it to buy their first tank, along with 7 infantry. For their combat move, they are moving into Karelia. They do send a guy and a tank with the bomber to try to take out that Italian tank that is there. They're also moving back into Belarusia and staying out of Ukraine. They've opted to let that one rest for the moment. They do not take Karelia, if you can believe it. They were huge favorites going into that. They missed everything in the first round. The Italian tank got a hit, lost the guy. Second round, didn't hit anything. The Italians got another hit, took out the tank. The bomber did persist in round 3, wanting desperately to get rid of that Italian tank, lest it make a blitz across the north end there. They were able to take out the Italian tank, but not take the territory. So the Italians, if they really want to, will be able to build in Karelia on their turn when it comes time. We'll see if they decide to take advantage of that. But they were successful in Belorussia. They did take out the units that were there. Losses this time are dead even. They've got 8 on each side. For their non-combat moves, it is all hands, nearly all hands anyway, to Caucasus to try to defend that space. One guy steps forward into Archangel just to enjoy the weather, I guess. I'm not sure, but that's what he's doing up there. Another guy steps into East Ukraine, and then everybody else down into Caucasus. Bit of a bad break there for the Soviets in Karelia.
That is pretty tough for the Soviet Union. I still don't think losing the Italian fighter was the best choice. I mean, I guess it worked out because they got a lot of material out of that tank. I don't know if I love the infantry into Archangel. I would let them roll into Archangel with a tank and then just counterattack their tank and destroy it.
Yeah, this may have been a reflex, right? Like you're just used to having a guy in an Archangel to stop traffic coming from Karelia to Moscow. They mobilize the new units. That's 3 infantry and a tank into Moscow, the rest into Caucasus, making that 15 infantry in Caucasus. Pretty healthy stack.
So again, just quickly, without having done all the math on Caucasus, I might have put another infantry in Russia and the tank in the Caucasus, because you could then send all 4 tanks to India to support a British move there in the future.
The Russians turn it over to the Germans, who are starting their third turn with 38 IPCs. They used it to purchase 8 infantry, an artillery, and a fighter. I do like this purchase. I like mixing in an air unit with cheap land units. This is my favorite kind of purchase, particularly for the Germans. For their combat move, they are going to continue to push to the east. They're after Belorussia and East Ukraine this time with no fear. They're not going in Archangel, and of course they don't have to take Karelia because the Italians already own it. Good for them. They're into Belorussia heavy, but they're only into East Ukraine with 2 infantry, 2 fighters, and a bomber. And they are successful in both battles. They only lost 1 infantry there. The Russians lost 3. For non-combat, they are making a big stack now in East Poland. The stack in Belorussia might look a little scary. They've got themselves, looks like 9 tanks there, but only 3 infantry. They've got another big stack moving to Poland, and the air units are landing in Germany. The land units that were in Egypt have moved over into Transjordan. They mobilize everyone into Germany and collect 38 IPCs yet again.
I think it's interesting that they pulled their 2 infantry out of Ukraine. I don't know if the idea is for Italy to abandon Ukraine also. You know, obviously Russia can counterattack there. It kind of takes the pressure off of the Caucasus. Russia is free to send tanks south to help in India. So I feel like it kind of frees Russia up.
All right, the Germans turn the action over to the United Kingdom. They've got 32 IPCs this time. With those 32 IPCs, the UK decides to pick up 6 infantry and artillery and a fighter. For their combat moves, they want to try to clear the 2 guys in eastern Ukraine for the Russians, which I think is a curious choice. They want to get rid of the 2 guys. They send in a tank, 2 fighters, and the bomber to try to clear that guy. They blitz the tank from Norway through Finland and into Karelia. So they get to take command of Finland and liberate Karelia, a victory city. And they land in France, again, another victory city, and they take Northwest Europe. So they basically spider out a bit to try to grab a bunch of money on this turn. They also step up from Belgian Congo into Anglo-Egypt Sudan to take that territory away from the Italians. Important to note here that they did not take Calcutta back. They could have with these 6 infantry, the artillery, and maybe some of those air units that went into eastern Ukraine. They opted not to go back into Calcutta. We'll see how that works out for them. Of course, they are successful in taking all of the undefended territories without any trouble, but they did lose the tank in eastern Ukraine and only got 1 of the guys, if you can believe that. They went into that with an attack value of 13 against a defense value of 4, and only got 1 hit. And they got a hit in return, killed the tank. So now there's still an infantry left in eastern Ukraine that the Russians are going to have to deal with. And the UK is down an incredibly valuable tank. So I'm not sure this was an advisable move. I suppose it would be genius if it would have worked. For their non-combat moves, the fleet evacuates Sea Zone 5 and moves down into Sea Zone 7. So the entire party now is in the English Channel, essentially, off the coast of France and Northwest Europe. The two fighters that were on the carrier in Sea Zone 5 move over to Moscow, while the bomber that was in eastern Ukraine lands in Caucasus. The two fighters that were in eastern Ukraine move down to Persia, so they have decided to stand in Persia against the Italians that'll be coming in, and perhaps the Japanese that will be coming over as well. They mobilize the 6th Infantry, the artillery, and the fighter. The fighter lands on the carrier in Sea Zone 7, but the rest of the land units, of course, are mobilizing in London. Doug, any thoughts about UK's move here on UK3?
I like their Atlantic and European moves. Again, the Eastern Ukraine, I like it, but it didn't go well for them, so I don't like it,
So in a huge economic swing for the United Kingdom, after picking up both Scandinavian territories and the entire Western Front in France and Northwest Europe, but of course down Calcutta, Egypt, and Transjordan, they collect 38 IPCs and turn the action over to the Italians. They've got 16 IPCs to get their turn started. They are going to purchase 2 tanks and 2 guys to spend it all. For their combat move, they send the battleship and the cruiser through the Suez Canal with an artillery and a guy to attack from Sea Zone 34, Anglo-Egypt, Sudan, with the tank coming down from Egypt. So they're looking to clear this so that they can sweep through the rest of Africa and pick up the money. Or to make sure that the UK can't close the Suez Canal with the Italian fleet on the wrong side of it. So I think this might be a clever strategic choice to make sure that they don't get stuck on the wrong side of the canal. It also stops them from being able to reinforce Calcutta here, because now that the UK hasn't taken Calcutta, the Japanese can move in, they can land air units, the Italians can be there, the Germans, in theory, could come in and land air units, so it could make it very, very difficult for the Allies to try to take this back, but they've opted to kind of take a more incremental approach as they move towards that goal. That was their only combat this time, and it was successful. They did lose 1 infantry in the exchange, so 7-3, Axis versus the Allies there. For their non-combat, they move a tank into Germany. They move another one into Poland, a guy into East Poland, and a guy into Ukraine. So they're kind of sprinkled around. But they do consolidate the fleet into Sea Zone 34. Now, it's worth noting here that if the UK really wants to, they can kill the 2 infantry and the tank in Transjordan and close the Suez Canal anyway. So this is going to be a spot to watch. They mobilize the 2 tanks and the infantry into Rome, giving them a total of 5 infantry and 2 tanks in their capital. That is the end of the Italians' turn. They collect themselves 14 IPCs this turn, but the US, they saved 6 in the last round, so this time they're starting the round with 44 IPCs. They purchased 3 fighters and a carrier in this round. They are definitely looking to get on the move. They opt to do no combat this time, moving directly into non-combat. The destroyer that has made its way through the Panama Canal in Sea Zone 20 is moving around the Horn and is in Sea Zone 56. Now, the rest of the fleet moves out of Iwo Jima. They do leave a guy on the island there so that the Japanese can't just jump over and pick it up for free. But they move everything back to Sea Zone 53. They're there now with 3 carriers with 5 fighters on it, a battleship, a cruiser, a sub, and a transport with a guy and a tank. The destroyer is in Sea Zone 56. But it's being joined very quickly by a carrier and 2 fighters, the 3rd fighter, of course, landing in the western United States. So China this time doesn't do anything. They don't get to produce any units because they only control 1 territory, and they don't opt to attack or move in any way. So China didn't do anything this turn, which ends round 3. Doug, what do you think about round 3 this time?
I think round 3 was pretty well played by both sides overall. I feel like there might have been a couple of opportunities for the Allies to capitalize on, and I think I would have made an attack with China, letting Japan do whatever they want. You're not pulling them north or distracting them in any way, but if you attack south, 5-on-1, Japan has to make some decisions. The other thought is I wonder what it would have looked like for America to send their fleet to 51 around the Caroline Islands and capture the territory and then leave a blocker in Sea Zone 60 around Okinawa. If you pull all of particularly with the attack of China, if you pull all that Japanese air into there, now their fleet is maybe be vulnerable to your bombers, and you're just, again, not letting them kind of rule the seas and do whatever they want. So that would have been an alternative that I would have seriously considered. Maybe they did it the table. But I think what they did is fine. I think it makes total sense to pull America back and regroup a little bit.
On to round 4, and Japan, for their 4th turn, they've got 41 IPCs to spend. They spend 40 of it and save 1. They pick themselves up a bomber, a fighter, 2 subs, and 2 guys. For their combat move, they spread out a bit. They pick up Yakut, Sherbet, and the Soviet Far East. And of course, they grab those without any trouble, and that is all of their combat this time. They move into non-combat. Now that there is no longer a threat on Tokyo, the whole show moves back to C-Zone 36 with 2 transports full of guys now fresh into French Indochina, Thailand. They pulled a bunch of the guys out of Buryatia and all of the guys out of Japan. So the only thing left in Japan on the defense is an AA gun, which is a bit unusual. They also stepped down from Ningxia into Xikang. They moved the 2 tanks up to Yunnan. I like this move because it gives them the option to hit the guys in Qinghai and double back if they need to attack Calcutta. So I think this is a good spot for those tanks. French Indochina now has 4 infantry, 2 fighters, and a bomber. And Burma, of course, has the infantry and the artillery in it. So they're in a pretty good spot there. I like it because now, even if this American fleet moves in and tries to take Manila, they've got everything that they need to take it back. If the UK steps in here to try to take it, they've got mountains of things that can come in and try to take it back. They mobilize everything in and around Japan, the 2 subs into C-Zone 62, and end their turn. Any thoughts on J4?
I think it was a good move from Japan. You grab the Russian territories up north, bolstering your economy. You put yourself in a position to take China out of the picture or India, and you put your fleet in a great spot to pivot multiple directions. Great move by Japan. I really like it.
The Soviets purchase 6 infantry and an artillery. For their combat move, they want to continue to trade on that western front. They can't get into Belarus this time. There's too many tanks there. But they do go after the guy that was a monster standing up to the UK in the eastern Ukraine with a couple of infantry and air units. They go into Ukraine with an infantry and an artillery to try to take out the 1 Italian guy that's there. And they are successful all around, taking both of those territories and taking no losses of their own. So that is 6 lost for the Axis, none for the Allies. Quick correction here. One of the things that I noticed as we were putting this together, the bomber that I was showing earlier in Caucasus was actually in Moscow. Not that it made any difference to the game, but it's going to matter now because the Russians have moved out of the Caucasus almost entirely. They leave a couple of guys there in case the Italians want to try to come through, but for the most part, they have abandoned this space in favor of defending their capital. They've got a couple of guys in Novosibirsk who look like they might be trying to help out their Chinese friends there in Qinghai. They've got some blockers in Ukraine and East Ukraine, and again in Archangel. They mobilized 5 infantry into Russia and an infantry and artillery into the Caucasus. All right, coming into the Germans' 4th turn, they purchase 8 guys and a fighter. Again, this is a purchase that I like with the fighter and some additional land units to push folks around. I like it. For their combat, heading back to France. They're headed in there with, looks like 8 infantry and artillery and 3 fighters to try to clear that zone. Now they have to hold fast in the Middle East, but on the Eastern Front, they go into Archangel with a guy and a fighter trying to pick off that territory. They go into Eastern Ukraine with a guy and an artillery and a bomber to face 2 guys, and into Ukraine, looks like 3 infantry and a fighter to face an infantry and an artillery. These are thin fights all around, so they're starting to, I think they're starting to run a little low on infantry as they get closer to Moscow. But they also are headed up into Karelia with those 9 tanks and the 2 infantry, that all-important victory city. They are successful in clearing France, but they lost a bunch of infantry in the process. They missed in Archangel. They retreat with the fighter. They are successful in Eastern Ukraine, taking no losses, and it doesn't look like they took any losses in Ukraine either. They only lost 6 infantry for themselves, but took out a bunch of the Allied land units. I think this is a pretty good round for the Germans. Non-combat air units are coming back to Germany to land. They're making a big stack now in the Baltic states with an AA gun there. All in all, they're in pretty good shape. But they did leave that sub in C-Zone 13, so they might be eyeballing a counterattack now into C-Zone 7 with the air power that can get there. We will have to keep an eye on that. One thing to note, though, is that they did not take Northwest Europe this time, so that is a landing zone for air units that might want to get involved in the fight. They move out of Transjordan and into Egypt. So there are no Axis units in Transjordan right now. Watch this space. They mobilize. That's everybody going into Germany, of course, and that puts 4 fighters there now with a bomber. Pretty good stack of infantry and an Italian tank. So they're got a pretty reasonable force. So that ends the Germans' turn. They are collecting 32 IPCs. That number is starting to fall for them. This is not a good spot for the Germans if they want to be able to hold on to those victory cities when it comes down to the end of the game. Over to UK, they've got 38 IPCs, a pretty enviable position if you're the United Kingdom right now, and let's see what they decide to spend it on. They buy 4 infantry, 2 artillery, a tank, and a bomber this time. For UK's combat moves, boy, that Transjordan's looking pretty good, isn't it? They opt not to attack Transjordan, but they do decide to go all in into Paris. They go in with the dude from Northwest Europe, as well as all of the units out of the United Kingdom to try to retake France. They also sent the bomber on a strategic bombing raid into Karelia. There is no AA gun there, so they were able to basically make a free run at that. They got 4 damage on that, which is the maximum. And they were successful in taking back France, a victory city change. Losses this time, pretty light for both sides, but they had some significant shifts in victory cities, of course. For the UK's non-combat here, they kind of do a fighter shuffle. So what you're going to see here is the 2 fighters in France land on the carrier in C-Zone 7. The bomber comes back to Moscow. One of the fighters in Moscow goes to the United Kingdom, and one of the fighters from Persia comes back up to Moscow. The UK mobilizes their infantry, artillery, and the tank and the bomber all into the United Kingdom.
Here's a question for you. Would you have been tempted to attack Karelia and try to cut down that tank stack? It seems like you could have just went all in against Karelia and tried to reduce the amount of German tanks pretty significantly rather than retake France. What do you think about that, Gary?
I think you're right. I think going into Karelia would have been good. I think it would have secured Moscow, and it would have made it easier, perhaps in the future, to be able to come in and take Karelia back from the Germans when the time comes at the end, because there wouldn't be such a strong defense there. The biggest miss here is not taking Transjordan. Like sending one guy over in Transjordan to take that isolates that Italian fleet in C-Zone 34. So now the Italians have to come back, take Transjordan again, wait another turn before that fleet could come back into the Med if it wanted to. This takes a ton of pressure off the Caucasus, right? Because from C-Zone 34, they can go 15, 16, land in Caucasus. But if you close the Suez Canal, you get an entire extra turn that the Italians aren't a threat on the Caucasus. Over to the Italians for their 4th turn with 14 IPCs this time, and they use it to purchase 2 guys and 2 artillery. For their combat move, the artillery moves over into French Equatorial Africa, and the tank blitzes into Belgian Congo and then back into Anglo-Egypt Sudan. They want to be in a position, I think, to be able to move into Transjordan if they need to. The tank blitzes from Germany through Northwest Europe and into France. The tank that was in Poland moves into France, and all of the guys that were in Rome come up and attack France. So how did that go? Of course, they didn't have any trouble in Africa. In France, they had a monster roll and were able to eliminate all of the British units that were there very, very quickly.
Yeah, that's a really tough break for the Allies. I mean, Britain with that many units there, you think, okay, they got a foothold. It's going to be hard to get pressed out of there. And then Italy comes and just wipes them out.
And that's a ton of Italian units left over. Losses this time, there's only 2 Italian guys sitting there and a bunch of UK units, so you can tell exactly how that battle went. For their non-combat, because the canal is open, they're able to come back into the Mediterranean and position themselves off the coast of their capital. They stepped the dude that was in East Poland, they stepped him into Belarus to act as a blocker in the event that those tanks want to come up and get froggy with somebody. After mobilizing into Rome with all of those units, they end their turn. This time they've collected 16 IPCs, and they turn the action over to the Americans. The Americans have got 38 IPCs this time. They used it to buy a couple of bombers and 2 transports to go with the dudes that are in the Western United States. They've got no combat this time. They decide to move into non-combat, and they are headed back to Iwo Jima with that extra carrier and the bombers now landing in Iwo Jima. The transport is back, but the guys are on the transport. They're not on the land for fear that the Japanese might come in and swing an interest, try to blow up the land units, which is something that we've seen in other tournament games before. But they are putting the pressure right back on to the Japanese capital, forcing that fleet to maybe come back up and try to defend themselves. So it's a pretty healthy stack there. It's 4 carriers with 8 fighters on it. They now have a destroyer in the mix, which is good for them to go with a cruiser and a battleship and 1 sub. 3 bombers there now in Iwo Jima, so a pretty healthy force if they want to come into Tokyo. They mobilized that transport and the 2 bombers into San Francisco and Sea-Zone 56. The Chinese, they decided to send 1 guy forward into Ningxia. They didn't get to mobilize anybody because they only controlled the 1 territory, and that is how round 4 ends. Doug, any thoughts about round 4?
Yeah, America's in a tough spot. The Allies are not coordinating around India or in the Pacific at all, and America is literally moving back and forth between 2 squares. And if your plan is to bait them to move up, then you better have a plan after you bait them to move up to do something like take India.
Cat and mouse game in the Pacific this time, for sure. Into Japan 5. They start with a bunch for Japan. They used a purchased carrier, 2 destroyers, a fighter, and a tank. For their combat, they are going after the guy who stepped out in Ningxia with 4 infantry and a bomber. They are blitzing into Evenki with the tank, but then back to Yakut because they don't want to get picked off. And that is the only combat this time, and that is how it wrapped up. Non-combat, they've got a couple of fighters and a bomber and 2 infantry into Manchuria, 2 fighters and the bomber into Tokyo, and the rest of the fleet heads back up to Sea-Zone 62, but they did block 60 this time to stop the Americans from heading down there to take Manila. No change in the position in Calcutta. I thought they might move the guys from Burma into Calcutta, maybe leave a fighter there to bolster the defense, to stop the UK from being able to even make it a question. The guys from French Indochina moved over, so now they've got, looks to be 5 infantry there and an artillery, and the guy from Soviet Far East stepped back down into Buryatia so that he's in range of those transports. They mobilized the carrier with a fighter, 2 destroyers, and the tank onto mainland Tokyo. So now it's a total of 4 carriers now in Sea-Zone 62 with 8 fighters on it. That's a pretty good pairing.
That's a lot of Japanese material there. I'd be scared.
Japan collects 45 IPCs this time. That's a big number.
More money than America for a while now, and that's a problem for the Allies.
All right, coming into Russia 5, let's see what they want to do. They pick up 8 more infantry going into this fight. For their combat, again, pushing again against that Western front, they go into Belarusia to try to take out that Italian. They go into Eastern Ukraine, they go into Ukraine. They don't have a shot at Karelia this time, but they do send the 2 guys from Novosibirsk up to Evenki to take that territory that is unoccupied and try to chase that tank away. But that does mean that they won't be able to move into Qinghai to help the Chinese there. Let's see how it goes on that Western front. They are successful all around. They took Belarusia, East Ukraine, and Ukraine. Pretty even losses this time. Looks like the Allies lost 5 infantry, and they took out nearly an equal number of Axis units. For non-combat, that's the fighters and the tanks down to Caucasus. The sub moved into Sea-Zone 7. I think they actually did that last time, so they're part of that UK fleet there in Sea-Zone 7. They mobilized the 8 infantry. I think they're trying to build up a big stack there so that they don't have to worry about that German stack in Karelia, maybe coming with the Baltic states units into Belarusia. So they end their 5th turn collecting 22 IPCs this time, and they turn the action over to the Germans for their 5th turn. Germans are only rocking 32 IPCs this time, so they're going to have to be a little more frugal. They get themselves 9 infantry and a tank. They blitz the tank down from Anglo-Egypt, Sudan through Italian Africa and into Rhodesia. They are again pushing into that eastern front. They're after Archangel, Belarusia, East Ukraine, and Ukraine. They are trying to bottle in the Russians there, it looks like. See how it goes for them. Of course, they're successful in Africa, picking up that free money, and they are successful across the board, except again in East Ukraine. They lose the land units and are not able to claim the territory. They blitz the tank from Karelia through the Scandinavian countries, picking up Finland and Norway for free this time. That is a big economic swing. Those together, those are worth a total of 5 IPCs. That's 5 away from the UK, 5 into the German coffers. That's a big one. Losses this time. Germans are losing 4 infantry, but taking out 5 and an artillery for the Allies. So pretty even, but a good round for the Axis. For their non-combat, they send 5 infantry and an AA gun into France to bolster the Italian forces that are there. Other air units are landing in Germany. They send 1 fighter down to Rome. Otherwise, it's a big stack now in Karelia. They've got 5 infantry, 2 fighters, and looks to be 7 tanks and an AA gun in that space. Because of the damage on the complex in Karelia, they mobilized everything into Germany. They were hard up economically at the start of their turn. This was a big one for them. They are now collecting 42 IPCs, a 10 IPC swing in a single turn. That's going to be a hard nut for the UK to crack. We'll have to see how it plays out. Over to UK 5. They've got themselves 37 IPCs. They spend it on 5 infantry, 2 artillery, and a bomber. They save 2 IPCs this time. For their combat, they are headed back to Norway. They're headed there with an infantry and artillery, 2 fighters and a bomber, as well as 2 offshore shots. They also are going to grab Finland, Baltic states, and the Victory City in Poland. So they're doing a little money grab of their own here, but they're staying away from France. They are headed back to Calcutta this time. They're just going to send one guy, though, with a fighter and a bomber to try to grab that territory for free. But again, they don't take Transjordan. I'm not sure what the thinking is here. I don't understand why they're not doing this, because it would mean that that fleet can't now come back and try to hit Persia. Results, of course, they didn't have any trouble taking the unoccupied territories, nor did they have any trouble taking Norway, as it turns out. They took Norway and took no losses. They did not, however, capture Calcutta. They traded the infantry and the Japanese infantry. If they really wanted to take this, you'd send at least 2, right? But losses this time, it's 8 for the Axis, 3 for the Allies. Non-combat air units, all to Moscow, it looks like. So there's quite the airfield forming there. The rest of the fleet moves into Sea Zone 5. The rest of those units are staying in Persia, it looks like. And we mobilize. All of those units, of course, are landing in London. And that ends the UK's turn. They collect 28. They saved 2, ending the turn with 30 IPCs. Doug, what do you think about this turn? I think there was a lot of interesting choices in this particular move for the UK.
I agree. They should have taken Transjordan. I still think they should have just gone into India. If Japan steps in there with all of those infantry and artillery, then they have a bunch of 2s and all you're doing is attacking with 1s. I mean, I guess you can bring the air down. Maybe that's kind of their thinking on it. I feel like they're just moving a little too slow with Britain there. I'm not sure that landing the guys in Warsaw and Baltic states is super valuable, but I like the way they took Norway and blocked in Finland. I think that's good. They need that money back. So yeah, I think overall Britain did well.
Over to the Italians for their 5th turn. They've got 16 IPCs coming into this round. They pick up 2 new tanks and 2 guys. Over to their combat. They step from French Equatorial Africa into French West Africa, and that is their only combat this time. Non-combat, they're starting to see the threat there in Transjordan, so they decide to move up from Egypt and Anglo-Egypt Sudan, along with the guys on the transports, over into Transjordan. They also move an infantry and an artillery into France. They move a few of the infantry out of France and into Berlin, I guess, preparing for a counterattack later on into Poland. And now for mobilization, of course, everything is going to go into Rome. That ends the Italians' 5th turn. Coming into US 5, they've got 38 IPCs to spend, and they buy another carrier and 2 fighters to go with it. They are definitely trying to win the fleet race against the Japanese. It is also worth mentioning at this point that Adam and Brian and Eric and Brandon are all 4 of them are known as very, very fast players. So the clock at this point, easily an hour and a half, hour and 45 minutes on the clock. The idea that the Americans are buying another carrier here, most of us would be thinking, well, that's probably not going to get into play. So they're not worried about the game ending on turn 5. They're not even really all that worried about the game ending on turn 6. They're anticipating making turn 7. For combat this time, it looks like all the Americans are going to do is try to clear out that destroyer in Sea Zone 60. They're going to send a sub, as well as a mountain of fighters and bombers to easily destroy that. The question is whether or not it hits back, and it does not. So the destroyer dies alone. No casualties for the Allies this time. Non-combat, the entire party, except for the sub that was involved in the battle in Sea Zone 60, is moving back to Sea Zone 53. They got pushed back away from the capital again. And they are still in reach of Manila, but they could be blocked in theory in Sea Zone 51. They've got a big fleet there, and it gets even bigger when they mobilize the carrier and the fighters in Sea Zone 56. Doug, what do you think about this American move here?
I don't like going back to Hawaii at this point in the game, even if you're getting another 2 rounds. You want your carriers on defense. And America is putting themselves in a position where their carriers might have to be on offense in the last round. I'm just afraid that America's going to run out of time and opportunity here. I think it's getting real short for them.
So if you were curious what it would be for the Americans to go into Sea Zone 62, we ran it in a calculator. It comes up to about a 62% chance for Japan to win outright. Those are not the kind of odds you want when the game is on the line. So that's the end of the Americans. What did the Chinese do? They did nothing. They held their 4 infantry in Shanghai. They didn't opt to step into Xikang. They didn't make an aggressive move. So they only control the 1 territory. They don't get any additional units. And that is the end of the 5th round of play. Doug, any thoughts about round 5?
I feel like the Allies have maybe missed a few key opportunities here, put themselves in a better position later in the game. I probably would have stepped out again with China, pull pressure off of India. It's a victory city. I think that I would have done a little more aggression with the Allies. Overall, I think both sides are playing very, very well given the circumstances.
That takes us to Japan 6. They are coming into their 6th turn with 45 big IPCs. They are going to pick up 3 fighters, a bomber, and a guy. Japan's combat this time. They are headed after that sub in Sea Zone 60 with a destroyer and a sub and, of course, a bunch of air units. They take out the sub, but the sub hits back. Even though it hits on a 1, they opt to lose the destroyer and keep the sub in play. Non-combat this time. Big party in and around Manila. Sea Zone 50 is now full of Japanese naval units, with the exception of the destroyer that is bravely blocking Sea Zone 51, stopping the American fleet. I think this is a really strong move for Japan, and they moved everybody that could reach into Calcutta, making that very difficult for the Allies to try to take back. They've got themselves 5 infantry and artillery and 2 tanks there now. They mobilized the 3 fighters and the bomber and the guy into Tokyo. And man, looking at this position, Doug, what do you think about Japan's 6th turn here?
I think it's a monster turn. I think it's great. Now you have a bunch of land units, air units in Manila, and you got a giant fleet around it. America wants to be in a position to be able to hit multiple cities. I think it's a great move by Japan. I love the move into India also.
Over to the Soviets. They've got 22 rubles to spend this time, 6 infantry and an artillery. For their combat move, they do step into Yakut with 1 dude. They push into Archangel with a big stack. They push lightly into Belarusia. They push lightly into Ukraine. How did it go? Yakut was no problem, of course. Cold, but no problem. Archangel, they took everybody out there. They were able to take everybody in Belarusia. They were able to take everybody in Ukraine. They lost 3 infantry in the process. They took out 4 infantry and an artillery for the Axis. Non-combat this time, the sub moved down from Sea Zone 7, away from the UK fleet, and down into Sea Zone 12, I guess looking to continue to try to harass the Italians. 1 infantry steps into eastern Ukraine to make that a contested area yet again, and the fighter and the bomber land in Caucasus. They've got 9 infantry, 4 tanks there in Archangel. They mobilize 3 infantry into Russia. That's 3 infantry and an artillery into Caucasus. They end the turn collecting 24. They're back to even.
So I would have purchased 4 tanks and put them in the Caucasus to press south into India to help with a 1-2 in order to try to get India for the Allies.
Over to the Germans. They've got 42 IPCs for their 6th turn, with 6 fighters and a bomber versus 2 fighters, a destroyer, cruiser, carrier, and battleship. 58% chance of being able to destroy this fleet entirely. And if they do, it closes the door as far as I'm concerned. Doug, do you go at this? I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's dicey, because if you whiff, you could be in a tight spot because you lose all of your air. You already have numbers, and they're going to have to add to their fleet and not continue to put pressure on you if they're going to keep their fleet alive.
So what did they do? They bought 7 infantry, 2 tanks, and a fighter. They blitzed down with the tank to pick up the Union of South Africa. They opt not to go after that UK fleet. Instead, they send units into Finland, Baltic states, and Warsaw with aerial support. They also go down to Belarusia and into Ukraine, but they decide to give up on East Ukraine. They're not going in there anymore. It's messy in that space.
Not Eastern Ukraine.
We're not doing it. No way, man. Of course, they're successful in taking the Union of South Africa. They were also successful in every other battle. So they had a pretty good round that time. They only lost 1 infantry versus a total of 5 Allied infantry there, so a pretty good round for the Germans. All right, so for the German non-combat, the sub moves out of the Med past the Soviet subs. Subs do not block enemy movement. They landed some air units in Germany. They kept 1 of the fighters in Rome. They decided to abandon Karelia to preserve those tanks. If they would have had to stay in that area, they almost certainly would have been killed. So they moved out of that territory down to Poland, where they can be joined by the 7 infantry that are there. So I think this was a really clever move, and it's a thing that people don't often think about. Like, you can make a non-combat move through a friendly territory, even if that territory was just made friendly. They also sent a fighter down to Calcutta. Because they were able to isolate Calcutta this way, I think this may be why they felt comfortable coming out of Karelia. They mobilize all of their new units into Germany. Gives them a pretty healthy stack there now. So they're really worried about their 3 main victory cities: Paris, Berlin, Warsaw, and all of them are in pretty good shape right now. And I think the UK fleet is starting to feel the pressure of the Luftwaffe. If they're not, they should be. And that is the end of the Germans' turn. They are going to collect 41 this time. They're saved 1 from their purchase, so they've got 42 IPCs to end their turn. Any thoughts about the Germans here, Doug?
I think I would have moved the sub into Sea Zone 7 so it can participate in attack against the British fleet. I think it was right to pull the tanks out of Karelia, get that fighter into India. Smart to do that. So yeah, I really like Germany's position and their options this round.
Over to UK 6, they've got themselves 30 IPCs, and they purchase a bomber and 6 infantry this time for their combat move. So they go into Calcutta with everything that can reach. That is going to be 5 infantry and artillery, 4 fighters, 2 bombers, and a partridge in a pear tree. With that, they've got an odds of success of 95%. The question is, will they be able to hold it when the Italians come through the Suez Canal to try to take it back? They've got some other combats. They are going at the units that are in Finland. They're going at the units that are in Baltic states. They're filling their transports, and they're coming out with everything. These aren't victory cities, but they are kind of staging themselves for a UK 7 attack here. You'll notice that they're coming into the Baltic states pretty heavy, and they're just really trying to take out the guy in Finland.
It also prevents the blitz from the tanks in Warsaw liberating Karelia.
All right, so how did it go? They were successful taking out the guy in Finland. They took out the guy in the Baltic states without any trouble. And they did take Calcutta back, but they've only got 1 infantry, 1 artillery left to try to defend the space. They just took it, so those fighters aren't able to land there. Lots of casualties this time on both sides. Non-combat, the 3 fighters that went into Calcutta came from Moscow, so they're going to have to land in Persia, which is not a great spot for them to be. We've got a couple of fighters that are landing in the Caucasus and a bomber landing in Russia. These guys are all getting in position, hopefully, to be able to attack Warsaw on UK 7. They mobilize everybody into London. I want you to note here that there are no fighters on this fleet. What do you mean there are no fighters on the fleet, Gary? Oh, right, because they're down here because they're worried about losing Caucasus. We were talking about whether or not the Germans should hit this on Germany 6. Now, they've reduced its strength. The German air power strength has increased. This is almost a gimme at this point, a mountain of air power that can get over there.
Yeah.
Over to the Italians for their 6th turn. They got 17 IPCs to spend. They buy 3 tanks. They need to be mobile and move to their combat, which is to go after Calcutta. They're coming with an infantry and a tank and 2 offshore shots, 1 from the cruiser, 1 from the battleship. And they're sending 4 infantry and the artillery to try to pick off these fighters. Yeah, so I don't love this move into Persia with all of the Italians. I think you need to leave 1 guy out so that you can always reclaim the territory on Italy 7. Let's see how it goes. Well, they were successful in taking Calcutta, and they took no losses. They did lose all of the Italian units in Persia. There are no Allied land units that can reach Calcutta. I think you were right. I think a couple of tanks here in Caucasus would have made all the difference. So the Italians take control of Calcutta. They destroyed not that many units, 17 IPCs worth of units. They lost 10 of their own. For their non-combat, they move a bunch of guys into Berlin. If the UK is able to take France, or if they're able to take Warsaw, the Italians want to be able to have the last word and try to get in there and take it last. So this is why they've consolidated in the center. They also consolidate the fleet off of India in Sea Zone 35. They mobilize the 3 tanks into Rome. Over to the Americans for their 6th turn. They got 42 IPCs to spend. They buy 3 bombers and a sub. For the combat move, all they can really do here is take out that blocker. So they send a destroyer and an armada of bombers out to try to take out that destroyer. The real question is whether or not the Japanese destroyer hits anything back, and it does not. So the Japanese destroyer dies alone. For non-combat, this I thought was a really interesting thing because the Americans get to go last. So they sent 1 of the transports to 43 with a guy in a tank so that they can be in a position to have 1 last shot into Sydney. I like this move, but I would have also sent a couple of bombers into New Zealand. And then the rest of it moves up to Sea Zone 57. I thought this was interesting because it gives them the ability to stay out of range of the fleet, and they can't be blocked from Tokyo. They've mobilized the 3 bombers and the sub in the Pacific and in the Western United States. The Americans could have sent a destroyer or a battleship or anything into Sea Zone 48, which is the path for this fleet to get to Sydney. In theory, the Italians can take it, but it's not nearly the lock it would be if the Japanese are able to roll down here with all of this madness.
Yeah, I agree. I like the idea of the bomber in New Zealand, but yeah, you got to block 48 because Japan's got a lot of stuff that they can hit another VC with.
Once again, the Chinese push forward into Ningxia with their 4 infantry, and that ends the turn. Coming into the last round here, Japan can only produce 8 units per turn, so they buy 3 infantry, 3 tanks, and 2 fighters, the best defense that they can get with that production capability. For their combat move, they go into the guy in Yakut with an infantry and a tank. They do pick up Qinghai with a guy. They take advantage of the open C-Zone 48. They head down there with 2 transports and 2 fighters. They also head out into 51 with a sub, 2 fighters, and a bomber. They can't reach this guy in C-Zone 43. He's out of reach of any of the bombers or any of the fighters. On the defense here, the Australians have got 3 infantry and an AA gun to try to fend off the 3 infantry, the tank, and the 2 fighters. There's a trade-off in Yakut, 1 guy for the other. Of course, Qinghai was no problem. They take out the destroyer in C-Zone 51 with no issue. The AA gun shoots down one of the fighters, but it is all for naught, and Japan takes control of that victory city, updating our total. 13 IPCs lost for the Axis against 20 for the Allies. This might be one of the more important moves of the game. They're non-combat here. They move all of the naval units into C-Zone 62, so they'll have to be fought through, but all of the fighters and the bombers are landing in Japan. After Japan mobilizes their shiny new units, this is what Japan looks like. That's pretty well defended. They've got themselves 4 infantry, 3 tanks, 9 fighters, and 3 bombers, plus an AA gun. So yeah, pretty severe. And that is the end of Japan's turn. That takes us over to Russia's 7th turn. They purchase 8 more guys. For their combat move, they step into Belarus, they step into Ukraine. They're just trying to grab money at this point. They're heading over to Yakut, and of course they step into Karelia to grab that one back for free and change the victory city count. They're also moving into East Poland. Almost across the board, they are successful. Ukraine, East Poland, Belarus, Karelia, of course, they all fall, but Yakut, that tank, man, it stood up, it fought valiantly, it took out the guy, it took out the bomber, and held the territory. So losses this time, that's 4 German infantry and a Japanese tank biting the dust, but 4 Russian infantry and the bomber. Non-combat move, they are helping to consolidate in the Baltic states. They put the 4 tanks and the fighter in there. They also sent a couple of guys out to Novosibirsk and to Kazakh if they get into an 8th turn. They mobilized new infantry into Caucasus and Moscow. Turn it over to the Germans, who pick up 6 infantry and 4 tanks. If I'm Germany, I'm looking at this and I'm seeing all of my air power can reach that UK fleet in C-Zone 5. Do the math, and I can see that my attack value is 22. His defense value is 11. I like my chances in that fight. I go after the British fleet, and I think I also send in a fair number of guys from Warsaw to try to kill everything that's in Baltic states. I'm not getting back into Karelia, that's for sure, but I can certainly stop the UK from coming at another victory city. Germans are feeling confident with their defenses. They decide not to do any combat this time and instead move directly into non-combat. They move all of their land units out of Germany and into Poland. They leave 1 fighter behind. They move a bunch of land units into France as well. So they mobilize their shiny new units. That's 6 infantry, that's 4 tanks, going into Germany, making that a very, very difficult target. They're in pretty good shape to hold on to all their victory cities as the UK takes over. They purchase 7 infantry and an artillery. For their combat move, their only real choice here is Warsaw. They're going into a buzzsaw. This is what it looks like on the battle board. Run it in a calculator if you want to, but the odds of the UK taking this territory are not great, but you never know what happens when you roll the dice. But here's how it turned out. The UK retreated with 1 bomber, 13 infantry lost for the Axis, plus the bomber, versus all, essentially, of the UK land units, along with their fighters and their bombers. Not a great place to be if you're the UK. Non-combat, they landed what they could in Karelia to make sure that that was going to be hung on to. They mobilized their units. Over to the Italians for their 7th turn. At this point, it doesn't matter what they buy, so they skip that. For non-combat, they grab the infantry and the tank out of Calcutta, move it down to Australia. They make the Americans' long shot longer, so that is the end of their turn. That takes us over to the Americans. 7th and final turn. This is the final turn of the game. They've got to go into this fleet, and they've got to land in Japan. And the guy in the tank have to attack Australia. That's absolutely right. I like their chances going into this sea battle. This is what it looks like on the battle board. Put it into a calculator, you get 98%, 99% for the Americans to take this fleet. The trouble is, though, however, that they also now have to land in Tokyo. These are the units that are trying to get through this battle, and let's see how it worked out. Poof, yeah, they cleaned up in C-Zone 62, as we expected, sinking the entirety of the Japanese fleet, really only taking 3 hits in return, it looks like, plus maybe the hit on the battleship. So they only lost 2 carriers and a cruiser, and in exchange for the entire Japanese Navy. Pretty good round. You got to feel good about that. It ain't over. They still got to land. They've got 4 infantry and an artillery, and looks to be 10 fighters going into a wall of Japanese units. Here's what that looks like on the battle board. It might look pretty, but when you put it into a calculator, odds of success here for the Americans, a whopping 0.2%, my friends. But never say die. Let's see how it played out. All right, so there's 10 fighters coming in. That means that there are 10 AA dice to roll.
That's a lot.
That's a lot of hits. Oh. I got 2. I'll take 2.
That's no option.
2 of 10.
All right. 2 ones,
That's
2
good.
twos, and 8 threes.
2 1s, 2 2s, and how many 3s?
8 threes.
8 3s. So I'm gonna go first 4, and there's the other 4. Yeah. Yep. For the lady. 1, 2, 3, 4 hits. All right, 3 bombers. 3 bombers.
Bombers and an infantry.
All right.
3 ones.
That's
3
well.
ones.
You die like you live. Was it Oh yeah.
3 3. Remember when Jim whiffed at 17-2?
That's what we needed.
We need that here.
Yep. They absolutely need some deep luck if they're gonna take this one home. They're gonna need some big luck.
4, 5,
A lot of 4s.
7, 8, 9.
We whiffed on how many things?
What do you get? 17.
17.
Yeah, make a picture of mine. Yeah.
3 years
Gotcha.
ago.
You're good.
All the dice.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 10 hits.
10 hits.
All right, good game.
That's a lot.
Good game, guys. Yay.
Thank you.
Thank
And
you.
at this point,
Oh, yeah.
the
Incredible
Allies concede.
game.
After taking 10 hits, they concede the game. That would have been
Yeah.
just about all of their attacking units. Congrats to Brian and Adam. They are headed on to the semifinal match. Doug, what do you think about all this?
That was a good game. It was a crazy back and forth game. A couple little missed opportunities there. I think more for the Allies. I thought Japan played very, very well, and America to give themselves a shot there at the end. They had a chance, right? So
A chip in a chair. That's what they had, right? That's what it takes. Japan's play in particular was very, very strong in this game. I still think that not hitting the UK fleet on turn 1 created a lot more pressure on Germany than needed to be there. When you get to the end of this, it does feel like a pretty dominant win for the Axis. I mean, the final victory city count here is 10 for the Axis, 8 for the Allies, an obvious win for the Axis this time. If that 0.2% would have held true for the Americans, they would have been able to take Japan, which would have evened the victory city count and given them the lead in the IPC race. So that would have been a win, but nobody wants to hang their hat on a 0.2%. Is that something you are a big fan of, Doug?
no, I think there was a potential path to victory for the Allies there at the end and just couldn't make it. But the numbers were pretty overwhelming against them.
I think we're going to save that conversation, though, for the live stream. But I think this was a really great game played by all 4 players. I think this was played at just about the highest level that we've seen. Again, defending world champions, falling to Brian and Adam of Gamesmiths. Really great guys, and we will look forward to Doug and I. We'll be facing them in our semifinal match, which we will bring you next week. Doug, any thoughts about the game as a whole?
No, again, I think this was a great game by both sides. Easy to be nitpicky when you're looking through a game and kind of know the result of it. But I thought both sides played very, very well. And yeah, incredible game from some amazing players. Well done, both you guys.
Well, sir, I appreciate your time and insights. As always, we will look forward to seeing you in our semifinal match against Brian and Adam. I'm looking forward to sharing that game with everybody.
Yeah, it'll be good. Look forward to it then, Gary. Thanks for having me, man.
My pleasure. Thank you for watching our coverage of the quarterfinal of the 2025 Axis and Allies World Championships. Thank you again to our friends at Renegade Game Studios for sponsoring this video series. Make sure to follow the link in the description and the pinned comment to check out the full line of Axis and Allies products and so much more. We hope that you'll be back for our live stream on Friday after this video is published. They are always a lot of fun. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and the bell to get notified when the next video in this series is ready. And if you want loads of exclusive content, invites to special events, and more, click that join button, find the membership level that's right for you, and become an official citizen of Board Game Nation. Congrats again to Brian and Adam on their quarterfinal victory. Tune in next time to see if Brian and Adam are able to take down Doug and I in the semifinal match. When that video is ready, you'll find it right here. When the live stream that followed this video is ready, it'll be right here. For our latest bit of mayhem, right this way. And if you're ready for more from Board Game Nation, click here to subscribe. My name is Gary Blevins. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.